Hey everyone. Tonight we're traveling back to a time when ruling a kingdom didn't mean vacation homes and golden crowns. It meant curses, betrayals, exploding cannons, and suspiciously timed accidents. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where the only thing more terrifying than the plague was being king. Forget the fairy tales and shiny suits of armor Hollywood loves to sell you. These were centuries where luck was in short supply, especially if you wore a crown. Some kings didn't just have bad days. They had historically tragic lives that read like a medieval horror story, scribbled by a particularly sadistic monk. So, before you get too cozy under your modern, parasite-free blanket, maybe grab a warm drink and settle in. Because tonight, we're diving into the unluckiest kings the Middle Ages had to offer. From the monarch who lasted 5 days on the throne to the one who thought he was made of glass, the Game of Thrones is nothing compares to theirs. Ever heard of a king who was crowned at birth and years before his diaper changed? Eager to know what happened? Let's find out. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the year 1327, or maybe 1399, or maybe 1483. It honestly doesn't matter. In this episode, you're going to learn what it really meant to be king, in an age when even the gods seemed to be rolling the dice just to see who'd fall first. So close your eyes, or keep them half open, and let's drift back to a time when ruling a kingdom was the most dangerous job you could possibly have. Welcome to boring history for sleep. Imagine waking up each day knowing that half your kingdom would rather see you dead than obey your taxes, that your closest advisors are probably plotting your downfall while pretending to fetch your wine, and that one wrong word, just one, could land you on the wrong end of a dagger, an arrow, or a particularly nasty rumour. And if that didn't kill you, well, there were plagues. Oh, the plagues, bubonic, pneumonic, and any other onic disease you could think of, all lining up to greet you like the world's worst fan club. Let's be real. The medieval period wasn't known for its spa treatments, or its deep commitment to dental hygiene. The average peasant might live in a one-room hovel with more fleas than furniture, but at least they had the luxury of being mostly ignored by history. Kings, on the other hand, lived in a permanent spotlight, one that occasionally burst into flames. Literally, in some cases. These unlucky kings weren't born under bad stars. They were born under entire constellations of cosmic oops. Their destinies read like cautionary tales, and every single one of them learned, often the hard way, that a crown was less a reward than a cosmic bullseye. From curses and betrayals to absurdly timed accidents, the Middle Ages seemed to reserve a special kind of cruelty for those foolish enough to rule. Picture this. You're crowned king after a suspiciously convenient death of your older brother in a hunting accident that everyone swears was an accident, but no one can look you in the eye while saying it. You're 14, terrified, and suddenly in charge of a realm filled with nobles who can't agree on which end of a sword is the business end, let alone who should be running the country. The moment the crown is placed on your head, the cosmic dice start rolling, and you start praying. Because here's the thing. Medieval kings weren't playing chess. They were the pieces. Pawns, bishops, knights, and occasionally sacrificial queens, all lined up on a board where fate itself was the real opponent. And fate, in the Middle Ages, had a wicked sense of humour. Take disease, for instance. Not content to ravage the peasantry, plagues had a particular fondness for kings. It was like the Grim Reaper had a VIP list, and every royal name was written in Gothic calligraphy. The Black Death alone swept through Europe like an apocalyptic janitor, mopping up entire dynasties with a single cough. But even if you survived the plague, you weren't in the clear. Leprosy, smallpox, dysentery. Medieval Europe was basically a petri dish of doom. And let's not forget betrayal. Oh, the betrayal. In a world where loyalty lasted about as long as a candle in a windstorm, kings were surrounded by trusted advisors who'd stab them in the back for the promise of a slightly larger castle. Your best friend, your cousin, even your own children. No one was off limits when ambition called. Kings learned to smile politely while wondering if the cupbearer was planning a little something extra in the wine tonight. But betrayal didn't just come from courtiers and cousins. Sometimes the whole kingdom turned on you. Revolts were practically a medieval hobby. Picture this. You're already dealing with a famine, a plague, and the suspicious disappearance of half your treasury, and now your subjects are gathering with pitchforks and an enthusiasm that can only mean one thing. Someone's head is going on a pike, and they're hoping it's yours. And just when you think it can't get worse, along comes superstition to really spice things up. Medieval Europe was a place where curses weren't just words muttered under breath. They were real, tangible threats. Like that time someone's enemy, accidentally, dropped a wax effigy into a fire while chanting the king's name. Suddenly, you're sprouting boils in all the wrong places, and your royal court is considering whether maybe, just maybe, you offended God, or at least the local bishop. But wait, there's more. Let's not forget family drama. Because nothing says unlucky like being born into a dynasty that treats succession like a medieval game of musical chairs, only with more poisonings and fewer party hats. Brothers turned on brothers, mothers plotted against sons, and uncles took up arms against nephews. Family reunions must have been a real joy. Pass the bread, and by the way, I'm raising an army against you next Tuesday. So here you are, a medieval king, perched on your wobbly wooden throne in your drafty stone castle, wearing a crown that feels more like a lead weight than a symbol of power. You're expected to lead armies, manage alliances, produce heirs, keep the church happy, and somehow avoid dying of plague, betrayal, or an unlucky fall from a horse. It's a miracle any of them lasted longer than a bowl of medieval porridge. But last, definitely not least, comes the question of luck. Because luck in the Middle Ages wasn't a rabbit's foot in your pocket. It was a cosmic joke, often delivered with a healthy dose of irony. You might win a battle only to be felled by an infected splinter. You could survive a war only to drown in a latrine. And yes, that actually happened to at least one king. So tonight, as we peel back the grimy, lice-infested curtain of medieval history, let's take a moment to appreciate just how spectacularly unlucky some of these kings were. They ruled at the mercy of fate, betrayal, disease, and a world that seemed determined to remind them, every single day, that a crown might be made of gold, but it was also a crown of thorns. Get comfortable, because the stories ahead are full of tragic mishaps, royal humiliations, and enough cosmic bad luck to make even the plague seem like a mild inconvenience. Welcome to the unluckiest chapter of medieval history. Let's begin. If there was ever a medieval king who could write a masterclass in bad luck, or just bad everything, it would be John of England. Born in 1166 to the legendary Henry II and the equally legendary Eleanor of Aquitaine, John had all the ingredients for a heroic king: royal blood, a famous family, and a birthright that practically screamed destiny. Instead, he managed to fumble every royal opportunity like a jester with greasy fingers. Even his nickname, Bad King John, wasn't so much an insult as a historical consensus. His life was a parade of failures, and his luck, if you can even call it that, was a cosmic joke written in the margins of medieval history books. Let's start with the basics. He was the youngest of Henry's sons, which in medieval politics meant he was basically the spare change you found under the throne cushions. While his older brothers, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey, and the ill-fated Henry the Young King, were off conquering lands and earning cool titles like the Lionheart, John was stuck in the shadow of his family's legendary drama. But when Richard died childless in 1199, John finally got his shot at the crown. Surely this was his chance to shine, to make a name for himself, to maybe even be remembered as something other than England's biggest disappointment. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well. The first sign that John's reign was a cosmic train wreck came in the form of France. You see, John inherited more than just a crown. He inherited a tangled mess of territories across England and France that needed constant maintenance, like a medieval Airbnb. Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, places you'd think a decent ruler might try to keep under control. John, however, treated them like a toddler treats a toy collection. He lost them, and he lost them with such staggering incompetence that even the chroniclers who hated him had to pause and marvel at the sheer scale of his failures. It all started when John married Isabella of Angoulême, a 12-year-old heiress who just so happened to be engaged to a powerful French nobleman. Naturally, this went over about as well as a plague-infested rat at a royal banquet. King Philip II of France, always on the lookout for an opportunity to nibble at English lands, used the scandal as the perfect excuse to swoop in and gobble up Normandy. John tried to fight back, but his military efforts were about as effective as a wet towel in a sword fight. One by one, castles fell, barons switched sides, and John found himself stripped of his continental holdings faster than you can say strategic blunder. But let's not stop there. John's unluckiness wasn't limited to wars and politics. It extended to his own kingdom like a bad smell. By 1215, he'd managed to alienate pretty much everyone. The nobles, the clergy, the peasants, and probably even the stable boys. His methods of raising funds were particularly inspiring. Tax everything that moves, then tax the taxes. This included inventing new fees, like scutage, a kind of get-out-of-fighting fee that barons hated so much they nearly invented a time machine just to complain about it on medieval Twitter. This king's luck took its most iconic nosedive in the summer of 1215, when his barons, sick of his greedy hands in their pockets and his suspiciously shifting loyalties, forced him to sign the Magna Carta at Runnymede. Now, Magna Carta sounds noble and inspiring today, a symbol of liberty and the birth of constitutional government. But in John's day, it was basically a medieval cease and desist letter from the nobility. Stop being such a colossal jerk, or else. John signed it with all the grace of a man forced to eat his own shoe. Did he respect it? Of course not. Within weeks he was asking the Pope to annul it, declaring the Magna Carta invalid, and planning a military comeback that would make any medieval therapist throw their hands up in despair. Naturally, this sparked a civil war, because if there's one thing John was good at, it was turning every possible situation into a flaming pile of chaos. And then came the cherry on top. The infamous baggage train disaster of 1216. Picture this. John, retreating from his enemies through the soggy marshlands of East Anglia, decided to cross the Wash, an estuary known for its shifting tides and sticky mud. His royal treasure, crown jewels and baggage train followed. Unfortunately, the tide decided it was time to collect taxes of its own. The water rose, the carts sank, and John's treasure, gold, silver, goblets, and perhaps even a nice pair of underpants, vanished into the mud like a medieval magic trick. Some say it's still buried there, waiting for a very unlucky metal detectorist to find. John himself managed to escape with his life, but his luck didn't hold. Weakened by stress, disease, and a sense that even the marshes were laughing at him, he died of dysentery in October 1216. The official chronicles say he died at Newark Castle, but you can almost hear the entire kingdom sighing in relief. Even in death, John couldn't catch a break. Some accounts suggest he gorged himself on peaches and beer before the dysentery hit, which is about as unlucky and embarrassing as it gets. His death left England in the hands of his 9-year-old son, Henry III, and a civil war that would last another year. It's hard to say whether the people were sad or secretly grateful. After all, John's reign had been one long exercise in bad luck, bad decisions, and even worse timing. Even the chroniclers of the time, usually so eager to flatter royalty, struggled to find anything nice to say about him. One monk summed it up best. Hell is too good for a king like John. King John didn't just lose wars or lands. He lost the confidence of his people, the loyalty of his barons, and maybe even his own dignity in a muddy estuary. In a world where kings were supposed to be God's anointed, John's reign reads like a cautionary tale from a particularly bitter court jester. He may have worn a crown, but it was a crown made of thorns, prickly, heavy, and just waiting to draw blood. In the annals of unlucky kings, John's name shines brightly, a beacon of how even the mightiest can find themselves sinking, sometimes quite literally, in the mud of their own making. Let's talk about Edward II, a king so unlucky that even his hobbies seemed designed by fate to get him into trouble. Born in 1284 as the fourth son of Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, a man with a name that sounds like he should be leading a heavy metal band. Edward II was, from the start, a royal disappointment. His father, a tough-as-old-boots warrior king who'd conquered Wales and spent his spare time picking fights with everyone from France to Scotland, looked at Edward II and probably wondered if there'd been a mix-up at the royal nursery. While Edward I was all about swords, horses, and the occasional brutal conquest, young Edward preferred hobbies like music, poetry, and, most infamously, building elaborate waterworks and thatched huts. Yes, he liked to play at being a peasant. Imagine the delight of the court when they discovered their future king hanging out with labourers, digging ditches, and thatching roofs like he was auditioning for a medieval episode of Extreme Makeover, Hovel Edition. For his father, this was less a phase and more a cosmic joke. But hobbies weren't the only thing that set Edward apart. He had a tendency to form intense, some might say suspiciously intense, relationships with certain noblemen. The first of these was Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whose cheekbones alone could launch 1,000 barons into open revolt. Gaveston wasn't just Edward's friend. He was his companion, his confidant, and according to more than one chronicler with a quill dipped in scandal, his lover. And Edward didn't just treat Gaveston like a favourite courtier. He elevated him to earl, showered him with lands, and made sure everyone knew who the real power behind the throne was. Naturally, the English barons, already grumbling about royal taxes in France, were not amused. Imagine a group of crusty medieval warlords forced to watch the king giggle with his bestie over lute lessons, while the kingdom's political house of cards teetered on collapse. To them, Gaveston was an upstart foreigner with a suspicious hold over the king. To Edward, he was a soulmate. It was, in short, a political disaster waiting to happen. And happen it did. In 1311, the barons forced Edward to exile Gaveston. Edward complied, briefly, then promptly recalled his friend in a gesture that was part defiance, part lovesick puppy. The barons responded with all the subtlety of a siege engine. Gaveston was captured and executed, beheaded on a lonely hill in Warwickshire. Edward was devastated. His grief-stricken wails probably echoed across the countryside, giving the local peasants something new to gossip about between plague outbreaks. But Edward's bad luck didn't stop there. Enter Roger Mortimer, a nobleman with ambition, a suspiciously well-timed army, and absolutely no patience for a king who couldn't rule his way out of a thatched hut. Edward tried to be a warrior king, like his father, but fate, or maybe karma, had other plans. His disastrous campaign against the Scots at Bannockburn in 1314 proved that leading armies was not on his list of talents. Edward's forces were crushed so decisively that even the bards struggled to spin it into a decent ballad. Scotland basically gave him a wedgie, then sent him home in tears. Back in England, things weren't much better. Edward's attempts to govern were about as effective as a wooden sword in a real battle. He bickered with his barons, taxed everyone into misery, and seemed oblivious to the concept of consequences. He managed to alienate not just the nobility, but the clergy, and even his own wife, Isabella of France. And when your wife, who happened to be the daughter of the French king, hates you, you're not just unlucky, you're practically cursed. Speaking of Isabella, she might have started her marriage with a degree of patience for Edward's quirks, but that patience wore thinner than a peasant's blanket in January. Tired of being sidelined for Edward's latest favourite, this time a man named Hugh Despenser, whose name alone sounds like a medieval con artist, Isabella eventually decided enough was enough. She formed an alliance with none other than Roger Mortimer, the same ambitious noble who'd been itching to overthrow Edward since forever. Together, they cooked up a plan that made every court intrigue look like child's play. While Edward was busy bickering with barons and fawning over Despenser, Isabella and Mortimer raised an army in France, sailed across the Channel, and basically walked into England like they owned the place. Edward, in a move that perfectly summed up his entire reign, panicked. He fled with Despenser, only to be captured in Wales, because of course he was, and brought back in chains. The once crowned king now found himself a prisoner in his own kingdom, forced to abdicate in favour of his teenage son, Edward III. The deposition was as humiliating as you'd expect for a man who'd once thought that ditch digging was a valid royal hobby. But fate, never one to miss a chance to twist the knife, saved its darkest joke for last. Edward II's final days are shrouded in mystery and more than a little horror. Officially, he died in captivity at Berkeley Castle in 1327. Unofficially, rumours swirled that his death was not only brutal, but also poetic in its cruelty. Chroniclers whispered that he was murdered with a red-hot poker, inserted in a place best left to the imagination, so that no marks would mar his body. Whether or not this grim detail is true, it's the kind of fate that would make even the most unlucky king raise an eyebrow. And there you have it. Edward II, the disaster-prone king, whose hobbies confused his court, whose friendships angered his barons, and whose entire reign seemed like a cautionary tale scribbled by the gods themselves. Even his own father probably sighed from beyond the grave, muttering, "Well, at least I tried." So, as you nestle into your modern, plague-free bed tonight, remember Edward II, a king whose bad luck, bad timing, and bad choices combined to create a reign that makes Game of Thrones look like a fairy tale. He's a reminder that sometimes, even with a crown on your head, you're not king of anything except your own misfortune. By the way, it's okay to drift off whenever you like. We'll keep telling these tales for when you need them. Next on our list is King Richard II, a very unfortunate king at that. Picture this. You're 10 years old, your hair is still in a bowl cut, and you've barely mastered your times tables. Congratulations, you're now the King of England. Welcome to the life of Richard II, a kid who got a crown before he got a clue. Richard inherited the throne in 1377, just old enough to be terrified of the dark, but too young to understand that ruling usually means people want to see you fail spectacularly. Being a child king sounds fun, but in the Middle Ages, it was like being handed a flaming sword and told, "Don't burn down the kingdom." He started off in the middle of the 100 Years' War, a long-running neighbourly dispute with France that had more plot twists than a soap opera. Not that Richard could do much about it. He was too busy being the human equivalent of a royal teacup, passed from one powerful uncle to another, each with their own ideas about who should really run the show. But young Richard wasn't just sitting around polishing his sceptre. Oh no. At just 14, he faced down the peasants' revolt, a full-blown uprising with pitchforks, torches, and the occasional decapitated tax collector. He rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End, and somehow managed to talk them down. That's right, 14 years old, and already giving motivational speeches. Even his enemies were impressed. But here's where luck, or something like it, started slipping through his royal fingers. Because the thing about ruling by personal charm is that it works, until it doesn't. And Richard? He started to believe his own hype. As he got older, his sense of kingly destiny inflated faster than a medieval bladder water bottle. He loved fancy clothes, elaborate banquets, and telling everyone just how divine and magnificent he was. He even insisted people call him Your Highness, instead of the usual My Lord. Because what's the point of being king if you can't invent new titles for yourself? The nobles, of course, were thrilled, if by thrilled you mean plotting his downfall behind the tapestries. They weren't impressed by his velvet robes or his golden shoes, They wanted a king who actually listened to them, not one who built his own private club of flatterers and yes-men. And Richard's luck just kept getting worse. He had this talent for picking favourites, his childhood friends, sycophants, and the occasional court jester with political ambitions. He'd shower them with gifts and power, like he was handing out party favours. Meanwhile, the barons were sharpening their knives, some figuratively, some literally. Then came the chapter known as the Merciless Parliament, a name that doesn't exactly scream pleasant tea party. The lords got together and politely informed Richard that they were taking over. His best buddies were executed or exiled, and he was left with a bruised ego and a very empty calendar. Did Richard learn his lesson? Of course not. This was a king who thought humility was for peasants. He bided his time, regained some power, and started plotting his revenge. By 1397, he'd grown suspiciously fond of banishing and beheading. Old rivals were exiled. Others got the axe, sometimes literally. He even created his own secret police force, because nothing says trustworthy ruler like a medieval Gestapo. But Richard forgot one crucial detail. Karma is a medieval pastime. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, future Henry IV, had been exiled by Richard, but Henry wasn't the type to stay banished. He returned with an army, a plan, and a look that said, "Surprise, cousin." Richard, caught off guard, fled to Wales, because nothing says strong leadership like running away to the nearest sheep pasture. But the Welsh didn't exactly roll out the red carpet, and soon enough, Richard was captured and dragged back to London. And here's where our child king's luck ran out completely. He was forced to abdicate, one of those moments where the royal crown suddenly feels very, very heavy. Henry Bolingbroke claimed the throne as Henry IV, and Richard was locked away in Pontefract Castle. Now, they say he starved to death, but let's be real. Medieval prisons weren't exactly known for their culinary excellence. Some say he was murdered, stabbed or smothered, or conveniently died of neglect. Either way, he didn't exactly get a storybook ending. No heroic last stand, no dramatic battlefield showdown, just a cold stone cell and a one-way ticket to historical obscurity. So, here's the moral of Richard's story. Sometimes being king is less about wearing the crown and more about surviving the day without getting deposed, imprisoned, or quietly murdered by a distant cousin. As you drift off tonight, remember, if you think you're having a bad day, at least you're not a child king in the Middle Ages. One day charming rebels, the next starving in a castle, all while your cousin tries on your crown for size. Moving on to the next unlucky king, the French king who thought he was glass. Meet Charles VI of France, also known by his fan club, if fan club means a bunch of worried advisors, as Charles the Mad. A king so unlucky, his brain decided to swap out royal logic for a funhouse mirror. And yes, I'm serious. He literally believed he could shatter at any moment. Charles was born in 1368, a time when France was basically a medieval panic attack. Plagues, wars, nobles who'd backstab you with one hand while pretending to kiss the other, business as usual. When he was crowned king at the ripe old age of 11, everyone probably thought, well, at least he's got a strong bloodline. Spoiler alert, the bloodline came with bonus curses. As a teenager, Charles seemed perfectly normal. Well, as normal as a medieval king could be. He wore fancy robes, waved at peasants, maybe even threw a joust or two. He had all the charm of a young monarch, with a kingdom to run and a treasury to mismanage. But by his mid-20s, something changed. One day, he was leading his army through the forest, all royal and heroic, when suddenly, snap, something in his mind just gave out. He turned on his own knights, hacking at them like they were surprise party guests. When the fit ended, he had no idea what happened. That's right. France's top job was being run by someone who'd just failed the medieval version of a wellness check. From there, it got even better. Charles began to believe he was made of glass, not in the cute, fragile but strong kind of way, more like, please don't touch me or I'll shatter into 1,000 pieces kind of way. He'd wrap himself in iron rods sewn into his clothes just to keep from breaking. Medieval fashion statement or early prototype of a human paperweight? You decide. Now, imagine being one of his advisors. You're trying to run a kingdom that's basically on fire, literally and figuratively, and your boss is convinced he's a stained glass window on legs. That's peak medieval HR nightmare fuel. But Charles's unlucky streak didn't stop at personal delusions. Oh no. His kingdom was the cherry on top of the cursed cake. While he was busy worrying about shattering, the 100 Years' War was raging on like the world's longest family feud. English armies waltzed through France like it was an open-air market, and the French nobility fought each other with all the grace of a catfight in a tavern. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to keep things together, but medieval queens didn't exactly get leadership training, and everyone had their own plans for the kingdom. Cousins, uncles, brothers-in-law. If you could claim a drop of royal blood, you'd be fighting for a slice of France. Charles would come and go, mentally speaking. Some days he'd act like a king, hand out titles, and smile politely at court dinners. Other days, he'd forget who he was, or even worse, who his wife and children were. One time he ran screaming from his own reflection, convinced that the people around him were trying to kill him. But here's the real kicker. Despite all this, they still called him Charles the Beloved, because apparently in medieval France, beloved meant occasionally dangerous, but wearing a crown. His glass delusion lasted for years, sometimes fading, sometimes returning like the world's worst pop-up ad. Meanwhile, the kingdom lurched from one disaster to another. It's almost as if Charles's fragile state of mind was contagious, spreading chaos wherever he went. And in case things weren't unlucky enough, there was also a little thing called the Burgundian-Armagnac Civil War brewing. Basically, France's answer to the question, how can we make this situation even worse? By the time Charles finally died in 1422, France was a mess of rival factions, burned-out villages, and battlefields. His reign had lasted over 40 years, but most of it felt like a medieval fever dream. One day he's king, the next he's a human glass sculpture in need of permanent bubble wrap. So here's the moral of Charles's story. Sometimes being a king isn't about leading armies or writing laws. Sometimes it's about trying not to break, literally, while your kingdom falls apart around you. As you lie safe and sound in your bed, no iron rods sewn into your pajamas, take a moment to appreciate just how unlucky Charles VI really was. He started as the beloved and ended as the mad, trapped in a kingdom that seemed to crumble every time he blinked. A king who believed he was made of glass, while his enemies were made of iron and ambition. A man whose greatest battle wasn't fought with swords or armies, but with the demons inside his own mind. And if that's not the definition of bad luck, I don't know what is. Anyways, enough of Charles. Let's move on to the next weird story of another unlucky king. Imagine inheriting the throne before you could even walk. Your father dead from war wounds, and a kingdom teetering on the brink of total chaos. Congratulations, you're Henry VI of England, the medieval king who wore the crown like it was an iron yoke. Born in 1421, right in the middle of the 100 Years' War, a conflict so long it needed a calendar instead of a battlefield, Henry's life was a medieval exercise in cosmic misfortune. His father, Henry V, was the golden boy of English kings, Victor of Agincourt, France's worst nightmare, and a master of the battlefield. He died young, just a few months before Henry VI's first birthday, leaving behind a kingdom that was technically winning a war, but practically one bad siege away from financial meltdown. The French hated the English. The English hated paying taxes. The nobles hated each other. And into this lovely stew of conflict and resentment, they plopped a baby in a crown. Henry was crowned King of England at the tender age of 8 months. Not exactly an age renowned for political brilliance or firm decision-making. And just to make things even more complicated, he also inherited the title of King of France, thanks to the Treaty of Troyes, which claimed Henry V's heirs would rule both kingdoms. Technically, this made Henry VI king of 2 realms. Realistically, it made him king of exactly 0 realms he could control. While Henry was teething, his uncle, the Duke of Bedford, ran things in France and tried to hold the line against a country that was getting very tired of English rule. In England, another uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, tried to keep the barons in line, like herding cats in plate armour. Meanwhile, Henry's mother, Catherine of Valois, decided royal widowhood wasn't her thing and may have taken up with a commoner. A scandal, but also just the beginning of the long list of things this kid would have to worry about. As Henry grew up, people hoped he'd grow into his father's boots. Spoiler alert, he didn't. He was gentle, pious, and mild-mannered. Great qualities for a monk or a medieval Instagram influencer, but not so great when your job description included lead armies, stop rebellions, and not lose France. Instead of roaring into adulthood with a sword and a battle cry, Henry preferred prayer books, church building, and long, contemplative silences. Which would have been fine, if not for the fact that England was still at war with France, the barons were at each other's throats, and the treasury was emptier than a plague victim's wallet. While Henry was busy reading Psalms, Joan of Arc appeared in France, lifted the siege of Orléans, and turned the tide of the war. The French rallied, the English retreated, and before long, France was slipping through Henry's fingers like sand in an hourglass. By the time Henry actually set foot in France to be crowned, the war was already lost in everything but name. The English territories in France shrank faster than a wool tunic in a boiling cauldron, and by 1453, when Henry was in his early 30s, England had lost all its continental holdings except Calais. Not exactly a shining moment for a man still carrying the title of King of France. But war abroad was only half the fun. At home, Henry's rule was like a slow-motion carriage wreck. His court was split into factions, each one more conniving than the last. On one side was the Duke of Suffolk, Henry's chief minister, who seemed to specialise in losing wars and making enemies. On the other side were powerful nobles like Richard, Duke of York, descendant of a rival branch of the royal family, and unfortunately for Henry, ambitious enough to do something about it. To make matters worse, Henry's mental health was about as steady as a cat on a hot thatched roof. In 1453, right around the time England lost Bordeaux, Henry suffered a complete mental breakdown. For more than a year he couldn't speak, recognise his own wife, or even respond to basic questions. The kingdom was left without a functioning king, and nobles circled like vultures around a half-eaten carcass. During his catatonic episode, his wife, Margaret of Anjou, took up the political slack. She was a force of nature, ambitious, cunning, and determined to protect her son's inheritance. She also happened to be married to a man who spent more time in a mental fog than on the throne. The combination of Henry's weakness and Margaret's aggression turned England into a breeding ground for rebellion. Enter the Wars of the Roses, the world's worst family feud, where the Lancasters and Yorks fought for the crown in a blood-soaked Game of Thrones. Henry, naturally, was stuck in the middle of it all, like a medieval stress ball everyone wanted to squeeze. At first, the Duke of York's forces gained the upper hand, even capturing Henry at the Battle of Northampton in 1460. For a while, Henry was a prisoner in his own kingdom, a living symbol of all the instability that had come to define his reign. Briefly, it looked like he might keep his crown under a compromise that made York his heir, bypassing his own son, Edward of Westminster. But Margaret wasn't about to let her son be disinherited without a fight. She rallied the Lancastrian forces, and the conflict erupted again, more vicious than ever. In 1461, after the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, Henry lost his crown to Edward IV, the son of the Duke of York. Henry fled to Scotland with Margaret and their son, wandering the borderlands like a royal ghost. For a few years, they lived in a constant state of exile and failed rebellions, the last dregs of a dynasty circling the drain. In 1470, a Lancastrian resurgence, thanks to the flip-flopping of the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, briefly restored Henry to the throne. But by this point, Henry was so broken by years of imprisonment, defeats, and his own fragile mind that he was little more than a puppet propped on a throne. His reign lasted less than a year before Edward IV returned, crushed the Lancastrians, and reclaimed his crown. Henry was captured, again, and imprisoned in the Tower of London. In 1471, after his son died at the Battle of Tewkesbury, Henry himself was quietly murdered in the Tower, most likely on the orders of Edward IV, who didn't want any more messy resurrections of Lancastrian claims. And so ended the life of Henry VI, a gentle soul born to rule a brutal world. A king who spent more time lost in prayer than on the battlefield, whose mental fog mirrored the chaos of his kingdom, and who never quite fit the mould of a medieval warrior king. His reign was marked by the loss of France, the collapse of English unity, and the longest, bloodiest civil war in English history. Moving on to the next. If there was ever a medieval ruler who could win the prize for most diplomatic headaches, it would be Ludwig the Bavarian, also known as Louis IV of the Holy Roman Empire. Picture the Holy Roman Empire, a colossal patchwork quilt of squabbling princes, free cities, and suspicious archbishops, and then imagine a man trying to keep that whole chaotic mess stitched together with a thread made of spit and luck. That was Ludwig's life, except every time he tried to patch things up, the quilt caught fire. Born in 1282, Ludwig was a son of the Wittelsbach dynasty, a noble house that specialised in collecting crowns and curses in equal measure. His father, Louis II, ruled over Upper Bavaria with all the subtlety of a medieval hammer. When Louis II died, young Ludwig inherited the family headaches, along with a brewing rivalry with his cousin, Frederick the Fair of Austria. And if you think that nickname sounds suspiciously optimistic, you're not wrong. The Holy Roman Empire, with its shimmering name and chaotic structure, was a medieval experiment in collective anarchy. Technically, the emperor was supposed to be the supreme ruler of Christendom, but in practice, he was lucky if half the princes recognised his authority long enough to sign a treaty. Ludwig's path to that glittering but ill-defined crown was more like a brawl at a peasant fair than a stately coronation. After the death of Emperor Henry VII in 1313, the empire found itself with not one, but two kings, Ludwig and his cousin Frederick, each crowned by different factions in different cities on the same day. Because why settle for one king when you can have a civil war? The result was a messy free-for-all, known as the double election, a medieval popularity contest that quickly escalated into open warfare. Ludwig and Frederick spent the next several years chasing each other across Germany, laying waste to towns, seizing castles, and generally behaving like children fighting over the world's largest sandbox. Their conflict reached its comedic peak at the Battle of Mühldorf in 1322, where Ludwig's forces captured Frederick and locked him up. You'd think that would be the end of the rivalry, but no. Ludwig, in a move that probably had every medieval baron scratching his head, actually made a deal with Frederick. He released him and agreed to co-rule the empire together, a plan that lasted about as long as a medieval candle in the rain. While Ludwig was busy turning rivals into roommates, the Pope in Avignon, John the Theotune, decided Ludwig was too independent for his liking. The Holy Roman Emperor was supposed to get the Pope's approval, but Ludwig, with the subtlety of a bull in a relic shop, went ahead and crowned himself in Rome in 1328, without papal permission. This act of medieval defiance earned him a shiny new excommunication, the papal equivalent of being unfriended by the entire church. Did Ludwig take this spiritual slap on the wrist seriously? Hardly. He responded by appointing his own anti-pope, Nicholas V, a man whose main qualification seemed to be that he wasn't John the Theotune. This set off a bizarre game of ecclesiastical ping-pong, with Ludwig supporting one pope and the Avignon Curia supporting another. Imagine trying to run an empire while every cathedral is split down the middle, like a religious divorce court. But Ludwig's problems didn't stop at excommunications. Every time he turned around, another prince or bishop was rebelling, raiding, or refusing to pay taxes. It was like playing medieval whack-a-mole, only the moles carried swords and had armies. Meanwhile, his own family was busy stirring the pot. The Wittelsbachs were notorious for backstabbing each other, and Ludwig's brothers and cousins treated alliances like seasonal fashion trends, here today, gone tomorrow. Trying to manage this political soap opera gave Ludwig a headache that could rival any plague doctor's casebook. Whenever he tried to please one group, another screamed betrayal. Whenever he handed out privileges, someone else demanded more. It didn't help that Ludwig was an enthusiastic meddler, sticking his nose into every political pot he could find. At one point, he even tried to claim the throne of Sicily, a place he'd probably never even seen, because apparently, ruling half of Europe wasn't complicated enough. Back in Germany, his efforts to keep the peace were about as effective as a chainmail swimsuit. The princes, always eager to assert their independence, kept undermining his authority at every turn. They formed leagues, alliances, and conspiracies faster than Ludwig could sign charters. Even his beloved Bavaria, the land of beer halls and perpetual feuds, wasn't exactly a fortress of loyalty. As if all that wasn't enough, Ludwig's economic policies managed to offend just about everyone. He tried to standardize coinage, but the free cities hated the idea of giving up their local mints. He tried to stabilize trade, but the merchants complained about royal interference. It was like being a medieval chef whose every dish turned out burnt, sour, or crawling with maggots. No matter what he tried, it only seemed to make things worse. His relationship with the church remained a thorn in his side, festering into a full-blown infection. The excommunication hung over him like a medieval rain cloud, complicating every alliance and treaty. Some princes wouldn't deal with him at all, fearing eternal damnation for supporting a man who had dared to crown himself. Meanwhile, Ludwig doubled down, appointing his own bishops and treating papal threats like bedtime stories. Interesting, but not worth losing sleep over. By the time Ludwig died in 1347, while bear hunting, because apparently even emperors needed a hobby, his empire was a patchwork of half-fulfilled promises, disputed territories, and enemies who were probably planning the next civil war before the news of his death even hit the taverns. He left behind an empire that was more fragile than a stained glass window in a hailstorm. Ludwig the Bavarian, the man who couldn't catch a break, spent his entire reign juggling rival popes, rebellious nobles, and a kingdom that treated loyalty like a seasonal tax. He tried to hold it all together with a mixture of brute force, questionable alliances, and a stubborn refusal to back down. And for that, history gave him a crown, albeit one made of thorns, paper, and a whole lot of bad luck. As you snuggle under your duvet and thank your lucky stars you're not the Holy Roman Emperor, spare a thought for Ludwig the Bavarian, the man who tried to rule a kingdom built like a medieval jigsaw puzzle, only to find out half the pieces were missing and the rest were on fire. Next on our list of most unlucky kings is Peter of Castile. Just before we dive into his story, know that you're free to drift off whenever you like. We'll keep telling these tales for when you need them. If you think your family reunions are awkward, allow me to introduce Peter of Castile, the king whose entire life was a masterclass in medieval paranoia. Born in 1334, Peter was crowned king at the tender age of 16. That's the age when most teenagers are learning to talk to girls, not how to manage a kingdom full of backstabbing relatives and professional assassins. But hey, medieval Spain didn't believe in slow starts. At first, Peter might have seemed like any other teenage king, loud, dramatic, and with a fondness for shiny things. But the moment he put on the crown, the trust issues started to bubble up like a suspicious stew. It didn't help that his kingdom was basically a medieval reality show. Uncles, cousins, stepmothers. Everyone wanted a piece of the throne. Peter quickly realized that in Castile, trust was about as common as a day without fleas. So he did what any teenager with absolute power might do. He started eliminating his enemies. And by eliminating, I mean they ended up with a one-way ticket to the afterlife, courtesy of Peter's personal execution squad. But here's the twist. Peter didn't just kill enemies. He also killed friends. And sometimes, he'd kill you on Monday and send flowers to your funeral on Tuesday. His paranoia didn't discriminate. If you looked at him funny, or maybe even coughed in his direction, he'd add you to his growing list of people to trust, absolutely never. His own family wasn't safe either. Peter's half-brothers, he had a few too many thanks to his father's habit of collecting wives, were in constant danger of accidentally falling off towers or mysteriously disappearing on hunting trips. One half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, decided he'd rather be king than wait around for Peter's next suspicious dinner invitation. Henry staged a rebellion. Peter, never one to shy away from drama, crushed it and kept on ruling with an iron fist. So iron, in fact, it left marks. But Henry was persistent. He kept coming back like the world's most annoying house guest, gathering support from France and anyone else who thought Peter might have crossed the line from strict king to please lock your doors at night. Meanwhile, Peter's personal life was its own medieval tabloid. He fell madly in love with Maria de Padilla, a noblewoman who, depending on who you asked, was either the love of his life or the reason he started believing everyone was out to get him. Peter's marriage to Blanche of Bourbon, arranged by people who thought politics were more fun than love, lasted about 5 minutes before he abandoned her in favour of Maria. Blanche's fate? Locked up in a castle like a neglected houseplant. She was eventually poisoned, or maybe starved. No one really knows. Medieval record-keeping wasn't exactly precise, especially when the king was in charge of writing the history books. Peter's kingdom, meanwhile, turned into a real-life horror show. Executions, confiscations, secret police. He was like the medieval version of Big Brother, except with more blood. His enemies called him Peter the Cruel. His supporters, what few remained, called him Peter the Just. But even they probably kept an emergency escape plan under their bed. Eventually, Henry, yes, the same half-brother who'd been kicked out multiple times, returned with an army and a French mercenary named Bertrand du Guesclin, because when you're overthrowing a king, why not hire the best? Peter's luck finally ran out at the Battle of Montiel. Cornered and desperate, he tried to bribe du Guesclin to switch sides, because Peter never met a betrayal he didn't want to buy. But du Guesclin preferred his current employer, or maybe he just liked a good plot twist. In the darkness of the night, du Guesclin led Peter into a tent where Henry waited. Peter lunged at his brother with a dagger, classic Peter, but Henry was faster. Or at least luckier. He stabbed Peter to death in a scene that historians like to describe as dramatic and totally medieval. Henry took the throne, and Peter's head got a new home on a pike, just in case anyone forgot who was king now. Never forget Peter of Castile, the king who trusted no one, and, in the end, got exactly what he expected. In the medieval world, sometimes the only person you could trust was yourself, and even then, you might want to sleep with one eye open. Next is John, the one of France. Guess who the next unlucky king is? Imagine being crowned king before you can hold your head up, only to lose the throne before anyone has a chance to warm your royal diapers. Welcome to the tragic tale of John But of France, nicknamed the Posthumous, which is a fancy medieval term for born after your dad already died. His reign was so short, it makes fruit flies look long-lived. If medieval monarchies were a game of musical chairs, John never even made it to the first verse. It all started in 1316, a year that already had France looking like the backroom of a plague doctor's office. King Louis X, known as Louis the Quarreller, which gives you a pretty good idea of his leadership style, had died suddenly, leaving behind a pregnant wife. Clementia of Hungary. Louis's death triggered the usual medieval meltdown, factions forming, barons plotting, and enough court intrigue to make a viper nest look like a knitting circle. While France was busy fighting over who should rule next, Clementia was sequestered in a guarded room somewhere in the Louvre, swelling like a royal balloon. The stakes were high. If she gave birth to a healthy boy, he would be the rightful king of France, according to the ironclad medieval law that everything important had to pass through the male line. If she gave birth to a girl, well, cue the backstabbing and a new round of Who Wants to Be a King. On November 15th, 1316, baby John was born, to what must have been equal parts celebration and nail-biting anxiety. He was declared king immediately, crowned in his cradle, which, let's be honest, sounds adorable if it wasn't so tragic. France officially had a monarch who hadn't yet grown a tooth. The Royal Council, composed of lords, bishops, and any noble with a decent sword, rushed to declare him sovereign, presumably before someone sneezed and caused a succession crisis. But John's luck ended faster than a jug of mead at a medieval feast. 5 days. That's all he got. On November 20th, baby John, King John I of France, died. Official cause? Officially, no one really knows. Infant mortality was as common as rain in medieval Europe, and even the best medical care of the time mostly involved prayers and leeches. Some said it was fate, others whispered darker things. You see, waiting in the wings like a medieval Bond villain was John's uncle, Philip of Poitiers, Louis XI's younger brother. Philip was a cunning, ambitious man, and he'd already been serving as regent while Clementia's pregnancy ran its course. With John dead, the crown conveniently fell into Philip's lap. He wasted no time seizing power, crowning himself Philip V, and probably breathing a huge sigh of relief that he didn't have to share his kingdom with a crying baby. Of course, medieval rumour mills didn't let that go unchallenged. Whispers began to swirl that Philip, or someone acting in his interest, might have hastened baby John's exit from the stage. Poison? Smothering? A suspiciously damp cradle? The chronicles are full of suspicion, though no one could prove a thing. After all, this was the Middle Ages, where even the king's cook might have his own political agenda, and a ready supply of herbs that could drop an ox in its tracks. Regardless of whether John's death was natural or suspicious, France was left in the hands of Philip V, who wasted no time solidifying his rule. He convened an assembly, got the barons to confirm his claim, and made sure that no one with a sharper dagger or a bigger army could challenge him. Under his reign, France would see new taxes, new laws, and surprise, a renewed sense that the monarchy was a place where trust went to die. But let's get back to John, the baby king who never got to do anything kingly. His entire reign was marked by other people's ambitions. His birth was political dynamite. His death, a convenient erasure of a problem. He never got to make any decisions, sign any decrees, or even babble at a court jester. Yet his short, tragic life left a mark on France in ways he could never have imagined. For one thing, John's reign highlighted the fragility of medieval dynasties. A kingdom's fate could rest on whether a baby survived its first week. The barons might talk about God's will and divine right, but underneath it all, it was about who could grab the crown before someone else did. John's death reminded everyone that power was less about divine ordination and more about who could get away with it. His death also set a precedent, one that would haunt France for generations. The uncertainty of his reign, the speed of his death, and the convenient rise of his uncle Philip all added fuel to the fires of suspicion and intrigue that would blaze across the kingdom for centuries. From the 100 Years' War to the wars of religion, France's nobles learned one lesson well. When the king is weak, the knives come out. And so poor John I went down in history as the king who never was. His entire reign was a footnote, a tragic asterisk in the annals of the French monarchy. He became a symbol of how quickly fortunes could change in the medieval world, how even the highest birth couldn't guarantee you'd see your first birthday, let alone your first battle. He was a baby born to rule, but not to live. Spare a thought for John Y of France, a king who barely had time to blink before the world took his crown away. His life was a flicker, a footnote, a reminder that in the Middle Ages, even a crown couldn't protect you from fate, or from the uncle waiting with a dagger and a smile. Another unfortunate king was James II of Scotland. Welcome to the tragicomic tale of James II of Scotland, a king whose end was as explosive as it was unlucky. James was born in 1430, the son of James I of Scotland, a king whose own luck ran out, courtesy of an assassination plot that turned a monastery sewer grate into a royal exit ramp. But don't worry, James II had plenty of bad luck left over for himself. Crowned at just 7 years old, because medieval Scotland loved giving the crown to literal children, James II spent most of his early reign surrounded by warring nobles who treated him like a pawn in the world's worst board game. While other kids were learning their letters, James was learning which uncles wanted to kill him. But James wasn't content to stay a puppet forever. As he grew, he developed a taste for real power, and unfortunately, real cannons. Like many kings of his time, he was fascinated by gunpowder. After all, nothing says "I'm the boss" like a giant metal tube that belches fire and noise at your enemies. Fast forward to 1460. James had grown into a fierce, determined king, with a streak of red hair that matched his fiery temper. He was determined to prove himself by laying siege to Roxburgh Castle, one of the last English strongholds on Scottish soil. Picture the scene: banners flying, soldiers sharpening their swords, the smell of campfires and horse sweat. And in the middle of it all, James, determined to make sure everyone knew who was in charge. He ordered his best cannon, nicknamed the Lion, hauled into place, a beast of iron and timber that looked like something a blacksmith might invent after too many mugs of mead. Now, medieval cannons were basically high-stakes guesswork. No one really knew how much gunpowder to use, or whether the thing would fire at the enemy or explode like a barrel of fireworks at the worst possible moment. But James wasn't about to let a little thing like physics get in the way of his big day. With the siege underway, James stood proudly near his beloved cannon, no doubt imagining himself as the hero of the hour. He gave the order to fire, and that's when luck decided to clock out for the day. The cannon, overloaded and under-engineered, did what any self-respecting medieval weapon would do. It blew up. And not just a little. It exploded like a metal piñata filled with shrapnel and regrets. James took a direct hit to the leg, which in medieval times was basically a death sentence. Blood, bone, and royal dignity went everywhere. The king, who'd just been envisioning victory parades and heroic ballads, now found himself dying on the battlefield, victim of his own enthusiasm for dangerous toys. His men, already in shock, rallied to finish the siege in his honour, because nothing says team spirit like avenging your leader's unfortunate cannon mishap. Roxburgh Castle eventually fell, but James's big moment of glory had ended with the medieval equivalent of a blooper reel. And here's the kicker. Some sources say James might have been standing too close to the cannon because he wanted to get a better look at the bang. Others claim he'd ordered the gunpowder topped off, just to be sure. Either way, his last moments were a masterclass in why you should always read the safety manual. In death, James II became a cautionary tale, a king who ruled by force, but died by his own weapon. Historians gave him a variety of nicknames over the years. James of the Fiery Face, thanks to a port wine birthmark on his cheek, and James the Cannonball Casualty, unofficial, but let's make it stick. His death left the kingdom in chaos, with his 9-year-old son, James III, suddenly the new king. Because apparently, medieval Scotland's answer to "what now?" was always, give the crown to the nearest child. So here's the moral of James II's story. Sometimes being a warrior king means learning when to step back from the blast zone. Enthusiasm is great, but maybe let the professionals handle the high explosives. As you drift off tonight, be grateful that your biggest worry is probably an alarm clock and not a malfunctioning medieval cannon. Next on the list is Eric the 14th of Sweden. All right, pour yourself a cup of lukewarm mead and pull your furs tight because tonight we're heading north to the icy kingdoms of Sweden, a place where kings had a tendency to come with extra helpings of paranoia, murder, and yes, the occasional suspicious vegetable. Meet Eric the 14th of Sweden, a ruler whose reign is best described as a slow-motion train wreck, involving too many axes and one very unlucky salad. Eric was born in 1533, the son of Gustav Vasa, the guy who basically founded modern Sweden, so expectations were sky high, which is always a recipe for disappointment. As a kid, Eric was smart, charming, and reportedly good-looking. But by the time he put on the crown in 1560, something in his brain had started to ferment. At first, things looked promising. Eric had big ideas, strengthening the monarchy, expanding trade, maybe even winning a few wars. But behind that shiny royal facade was a mind slowly unspooling like a broken lute string. Paranoia became his daily bread, and for everyone around him, it was the medieval equivalent of living next door to a bear with a toothache. Eric's suspicion radar was always on high alert. He saw enemies in every corner, behind every tapestry, and definitely in every dinner party guest. Courtiers learned quickly that the king's good side was the only safe place to be, and even that was temporary. One wrong word, one sideways glance, and you might find yourself in a dark cell, awaiting your final invitation to the chopping block. But Eric didn't stop with the nobles. Oh no, he brought the family into the fun too. His half-brothers, especially John, later John III, found themselves on the receiving end of his royal mood swings. After a few too many arguments about politics, or maybe just who got the last slice of meat pie, Eric decided the best solution was to throw John and his wife into prison. Because nothing says brotherly love like locking your siblings in a dungeon for a few years. Then came the Stuart murders. Yes, it even has its own ominous name. In a fit of suspicion that makes even the worst soap opera villain look stable, Eric had several members of the powerful Stuart family arrested for supposed treason. During a particularly memorable interrogation session, he personally stabbed one of them to death with a dagger. That's right. The King of Sweden moonlighted as his own executioner. By this point, his court was tiptoeing around him, like they were trapped in a room full of glass and rabid badgers. No one knew what might set him off next. Meanwhile, Eric would wander the palace muttering about conspiracies and invisible enemies, sometimes refusing to see even his closest advisors. And then, because fate apparently decided this drama needed a culinary twist, peas entered the picture. One day in 1577, after years of paranoia, isolation, and fratricidal mood swings, Eric sat down to a bowl of peas. Seems harmless, right? Wrong. According to one version of the story, those peas were laced with poison, because obviously, when you're living in a kingdom where murder is a family pastime, dinner is a dangerous sport. No one knows exactly who spiked the peas. Maybe it was an assassin sent by his brother John. Maybe it was an over-enthusiastic chef with a grudge. Or maybe Eric just had bad luck with legumes. Either way, the result was the same: vomiting, agony, and death. Historians still argue about the pea incident. Some say he was poisoned. Others say he was already dying of mental illness, depression, and medieval stress levels that would make anyone's head spin. But the legend stuck. Eric XIV, the king who thought the world was out to get him, may have been undone by a single bowl of green vegetables. His brother John, ever the opportunist, stepped in to claim the throne. He probably ordered a thorough kitchen inspection, just to be safe. Sweden, meanwhile, sighed in relief, glad to see the end of a reign that made everyone, family, friends and foes alike, reach for their emergency escape plan. So even a king who's convinced everyone is trying to kill him might actually be right. And sometimes, the thing that takes you out isn't a dagger, a sword, or a rebellion. It's dinner. Moving on to the next. If ever there was a king who'd probably wished he'd never heard the word curse, it was Philip V of France, sometimes called Philip the Tall, a nickname that, in the Middle Ages, usually meant has legs longer than the average peasant. But Philip's real claim to historical fame wasn't his height. It was the unlucky, overshadowed reign that started with a scandal, ended with a plague, and unfolded under the long shadow of a curse that allegedly came straight from the lips of the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. Let's rewind to 1314. France was ruled by Philip's father, Philip IV, Philip the Fair, though by all accounts he was about as fair as a tax collector during a famine. Philip IV was the sort of king who treated conspiracies and heretics like a to-do list. He'd spent years feuding with the Pope, extorting cash from Jewish communities, and, most importantly for our story, wiping the Knights Templar off the face of Europe. He accused them of heresy, sodomy, witchcraft, and probably every other medieval crime that sounded scary in a courtroom. Then he seized their treasure and burned the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, at the stake on a chilly March evening in Paris. According to the legend, and let's be real, the Middle Ages loved a good curse, Jacques de Molay called down a fiery condemnation on the entire Capetian line. From the flames, he supposedly declared that within a year, Philip IV and Pope Clement V, his Templar bulldozing buddy, would stand before God to answer for their crimes. And within a year, both were dead. Coincidence? Medieval Europe thought not. They saw a curse at work, something that would stick to the Capetian dynasty like fleas on a straw mattress. And here's where Philip V comes in. When his father died in 1314, France passed to his older brother, Louis X, a man whose short reign included tax hikes, noble revolts, and dying suddenly after a suspiciously short reign. Philip, who'd probably been practicing his "I'm next" speech in the mirror, became regent while Louis's pregnant widow, Clementia of Hungary, tried to produce an heir. She did. John I, the baby king who lived 5 days, which is medieval code for everyone's worst nightmare. With baby John dead and no other male heirs on hand, Philip V claimed the throne for himself in 1316. He argued that France couldn't be ruled by a woman, his niece Joan, Louis X's daughter, thanks to a newly minted and suspiciously convenient reading of the Salic law. This, by the way, was the legal equivalent of declaring no girls allowed in the royal treehouse. It worked, though, and Philip was crowned at Reims Cathedral in a ceremony that must have felt half coronation, half exorcism. But the curse, whether real, imagined, or just a clever rumour started by the Templars' surviving fan club, hung over everything Philip did. His reign was like playing chess in a room full of broken mirrors. Every move seemed to backfire. He tried to clean up his brother's messes, like a kingdom drowning in debt, nobles who thought loyalty was optional, and a grain shortage that made bread more valuable than gold. But nothing seemed to stick. One of Philip's biggest headaches was the so-called Tour de Nesle affair, a scandal that would make a medieval bard blush. It turned out that Louis X's wife, Marguerite of Burgundy, had been caught in an affair with a pair of dashing knights in the Tour de Nesle, Paris's equivalent of the local Love Hotel, only with more rats. The scandal blew up so spectacularly that it made TikTok drama look like a polite tea party. When Philip took the throne, he inherited the mess, with nobles whispering that the entire royal family was cursed, the moral equivalent of a dung heap, and that the Templars were somewhere in the afterlife laughing their heads off. Philip tried to put the kingdom's finances in order, but every solution led to more resentment. He cracked down on currency debasement, medieval rulers' favourite way to print money, by basically cheating on the gold content. But this made the merchants and townsfolk hate him. He tried to standardise weights and measures, a noble idea that mostly made everyone angry because, let's face it, no one likes a king who checks their scale at the market stall. And then came the Great Famine. Between 1315 and 1317, Europe was hit with a biblical catastrophe of rain, rot, and starvation. Crops failed, cattle died, and entire villages turned to eating grass, bark, and, according to some chroniclers, each other. Philip, newly crowned and already feeling the Templar curse on his back, suddenly found himself ruling a kingdom where bread was worth more than a noble's ransom. He tried to organise relief efforts, but it was like trying to fill a leaky bucket with a teaspoon. If that wasn't enough, plague and disease swept the land like an uninvited dinner guest, compounding the misery and reinforcing the idea that God, or at least Jacques de Molay, had it out for the Capetians. Priests preached sermons on sin, barons muttered about curses, and everyone looked at Philip like he might spontaneously combust. Even within his own family, the Templar curse seemed determined to sow chaos. His wife, Joan II of Burgundy, was accused of being involved in the Tour de Nesle scandal, a tangled web of sex, lies and towers that would make even the most jaded medieval historian raise an eyebrow. Philip cleared her name, but the stink of scandal clung to the court like mould on cheese. Despite all this, Philip was a capable administrator, a king who genuinely tried to steer France through the mess. He expanded royal justice, improved administration, and even began reforms that would influence future generations. But it didn't matter. The legend of the Templar curse overshadowed everything. Every failure, every drought, every scandal was blamed on the dying words of a man roasted alive in Paris. It was like trying to build a cathedral on quicksand. In 1322, after just 6 years on the throne, Philip V died suddenly. Some said of dysentery, others of the lingering curse that everyone loved to talk about. He left no male heirs, meaning the Capetian line was once again in crisis mode, like a soap opera with too many plot twists. His brother, Charles IV, took over, but the curse followed him too. He'd die childless as well, proving that if Jacques de Molay was inventing curses that day, he was dangerously good at it. Just think about it for a moment. A king who tried to do right but couldn't escape the shadow of a curse. The Templars' dying words may have been myth, but they shaped a kingdom's destiny, proving that in the Middle Ages, nothing, especially a flaming condemnation, was ever just a bedtime story. May all your curses be purely fictional. By now, you may be feeling really sleepy. It's okay to drift away at some point. Simply save the video for when you'll need it. Next is William II of England. If ever there was a medieval king who probably wished he'd just stayed in bed, it was William II of England, better known as William Rufus, thanks to his red hair and even redder temper. His reign was short, bloody, and, like the rest of his unlucky cohort, ended in a spectacularly suspicious death in the New Forest. Because, let's face it, nothing says unlucky king quite like getting shot by an arrow that may or may not have been an accident. William Rufus inherited the English throne in 1087, after his father William the Conqueror died, probably from sheer exhaustion after conquering half of Europe. Rufus was the middle son, a position that practically guaranteed a chip on his shoulder. His older brother, Robert Curthose, got Normandy, while his younger brother, Henry, got some cash and a confused expression. William got England, the biggest prize of all, but also the kingdom most likely to catch fire at any given moment. From the start, Rufus ruled with all the subtlety of a hammer. He taxed the barons into submission, squeezed the church for every penny he could find, and treated the English people like they were a particularly annoying stain on his royal tunic. His court was a riot of vice, full of questionable jokes, questionable morals, and even more questionable haircuts. Chroniclers at the time grumbled about his irreligious ways, no surprise, given that he made a habit of ignoring the clergy unless he needed them to bless his next tax hike. Rufus's relationship with the church was, to put it mildly, complicated. He kept the Archbishopric of Canterbury vacant for years, just so he could collect its revenues, a move that would make even the most cutthroat modern CEO raise an eyebrow. He played the bishops against each other like a chess master with a grudge. And if that wasn't enough to make him unpopular with the pious, there were rumours. Oh, the delicious medieval rumours about his taste for male courtiers and a court that leaned more towards the debauched than the devout. But while his relationship with God was rocky, his relationship with his family was a full-blown soap opera. His older brother, Robert, was the kind of duke who made the English barons long for a more boring, less rebellious overlord. The two brothers argued like alley cats over Normandy, with Robert constantly plotting to reclaim England and Rufus constantly plotting to keep it. Their little brother Henry mostly kept his head down, probably hoping to avoid the fratricidal funfest that seemed to come with the family name. So it was that in August 1100, William Rufus found himself in the New Forest, a vast tangle of trees, thorns, and the occasional angry boar. The forest had a dark reputation, even before William got there. His older brother Richard had died there decades earlier, in what was politely called a hunting accident. Apparently, the New Forest was less of a peaceful getaway, and more of a medieval Bermuda Triangle for the unlucky Normans. On August 2nd, William and his entourage set out for a hunting trip. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a corporate team-building exercise, only with real weapons. Among his companions was Walter Tyrrell, a nobleman known for his skill with a bow. The party spread out through the forest, hunting deer, shouting at servants, and generally having the kind of fun that required a lot of dead animals. As the sun dipped behind the ancient oaks, an arrow flew through the air. According to the chroniclers, and let's remember, these guys loved a good conspiracy, Walter Tyrrell fired the shot that struck William square in the chest, piercing his lungs and killing him almost instantly. Walter, being a man with an instinct for self-preservation, leapt onto his horse and galloped away like the devil himself was on his heels. The king's body was found by peasants, lying alone in the forest, the arrow protruding from his chest like a grim trophy. His noble companions, loyal to the last, had all bolted in various directions, leaving their king to bleed out on the forest floor. They carried his body to Winchester Cathedral in a cart, a royal send-off that felt more like a trip to the market than a state funeral. Now, here's where the suspicious part comes in. Walter Tyrrell always claimed the shot was an accident, that he'd aimed at a deer and the arrow had bounced off a tree before finding the king's heart. That's the official version anyway. But anyone who's ever read a history book or watched a single episode of any medieval drama knows that accidents in the royal family tend to come with a lot of convenient timing. Let's consider the suspects. First, there was Henry, William's younger brother. He just happened to be there that day, hunting with the rest of them, and he just happened to be the first to rush to Winchester and secure the treasury before the nobles could crown someone else. A week later, he was king, crowned and anointed with a speed that would have made a modern-day spin doctor proud. Coincidence? Maybe. Medieval politics? Definitely. Then there was the clergy, who'd spent William's reign being taxed, humiliated, and left without an archbishop. If anyone wanted him gone, they'd have found plenty of volunteers among the tonsured set. And let's not forget the barons, an eternally disgruntled bunch who'd watched Rufus treat them like ATM machines with titles. Of course, it's possible it really was an accident. Medieval forests were dangerous places. Uneven ground, branches like spears, deer that refused to die quietly. Hunting accidents were common enough that kings usually wore bright colours and were surrounded by loyal men. But William Rufus was the kind of king who'd turned paranoia into an art form, and even he let his guard down that day. Maybe the real killer was his own arrogance, his refusal to believe that anyone could bring him down. In the end, the arrow that killed him was as silent as the forest itself. Whether it came from an assassin's bow or an unlucky ricochet, it left England with a dead king, a suspicious new ruler, and a kingdom forever wondering if justice had been served, or if the forest had claimed another royal victim. Moving on to Sigismund of Burgundy, another unlucky king of the Middle Ages. If you thought Game of Thrones was brutal, wait until you meet Sigismund of Burgundy. a man whose entire life was basically a medieval horror story with a bad ending written in blood and betrayal. Born around 475 AD, Sigismund's story begins in the twilight of the Western Roman Empire, in a time when kingdoms rose and fell like poorly baked bread, and loyalty was about as common as clean bathwater. Sigismund was the son of Gundobad, king of the Burgundians, a Germanic tribe that had carved out a chunk of Gaul after the Romans collapsed under the weight of their own ambition. The Burgundians weren't exactly known for their subtlety. These were people who settled disputes with swords and poison, and whose idea of family counselling was, well, family feuding with a side of execution. Young Sigismund was raised in this delightful environment of court intrigue and paranoia. His father, Gundobad, was a wily old king who'd made a name for himself by playing both sides against the middle, allying with Rome when it suited him, betraying them when it didn't, and generally doing whatever it took to keep his throne. Sigismund, meanwhile, watched and learned. By the time Gundobad died in 516, Sigismund inherited the kingdom, a decent inheritance by medieval standards. Burgundy was a patchwork of lands, vassals, and rival chieftains, all of whom were suspiciously eyeing the new king, like hungry wolves sizing up the weakest member of the pack. Sigismund's first order of business was to consolidate power, which he did by embracing Christianity, specifically Catholicism, in a move that was part religious devotion and part political chess. Converting meant more legitimacy in the eyes of the powerful bishops of Gaul, and fewer excuses for them to label him a barbarian with a crown. It seemed like Sigismund might actually do all right. He founded a monastery at Agona, gave money to the church, and even got along with neighbouring powers like Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths, a man who could crush a kingdom with a single eyebrow raise. But here's the problem with medieval Europe. Just when you think things are going your way, your own family shows up with a dagger. Sigismund had a son named Sigeric. By all accounts, Sigeric was a typical young noble, ambitious, maybe a little hot-headed, but no more so than any other teenage prince whose favourite hobby was plotting how to inherit the throne. Unfortunately, Sigismund had also married a second wife, whose influence at court quickly became a cancer on the royal household. She apparently convinced Sigismund that Sigeric was plotting against him, a classic medieval move that usually ended with someone's head on a spike. Consumed by paranoia, Sigismund ordered Sigeric to be strangled. Yes, strangled, by his own father. If there was ever a time to pause for a moment and reflect on medieval parenting, this would be it. Naturally, this didn't win Sigismund any awards for Father of the Year, nor did it improve the general mood at court. Instead, it made him look like a tyrant, and gave his enemies all the ammunition they needed. Enter Clovis's sons, the Merovingian kings of the Franks, who'd been waiting for any excuse to invade Burgundy and take its crown jewels. Sigismund's murder of his son gave them that excuse on a silver platter. In 523, the Frankish armies led by Clovis's sons, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clothar, marched into Burgundy with all the subtlety of a battering ram. Sigismund tried to resist, but his kingdom crumbled under the Frankish onslaught like a soggy biscuit. Captured by the Franks, Sigismund was paraded around like a prize trophy, a cautionary tale in royal form. He was thrown into a prison cell, where he presumably had plenty of time to think about his poor life choices, especially the one involving his son. If he was hoping for mercy, he was out of luck. Medieval politics didn't do forgiveness. In 524, Clodomir decided that Sigismund's usefulness as a living trophy had expired. On a grim spring day, Sigismund, King of Burgundy, Christian convert, and proud father, at least once, was dragged out of his prison cell. Along with his wife and children, he was taken to the outskirts of Orléans. There, the Franks beheaded them all, one by one, with all the ceremony of taking out the trash. If there was a mercy, it was quick. though medieval executioners were never known for precision. But the story doesn't end there. According to legend, the Franks then threw Sigismund's body into a well, a medieval burial that was about as dignified as it sounds. His remains supposedly stayed there until monks, centuries later, fished them out and gave him a proper burial, turning him into a saint. Yes, that's right. The same man who ordered his son's murder ended up as Saint Sigismund. Medieval sainthood was, apparently, an equal opportunity employer. The irony is thick enough to spread on toast. Sigismund's legacy is one of betrayal and bloodshed. A father who murdered his own son, a king who lost his kingdom, and a saint whose relics would later become the prize of warring kingdoms. His life is a cautionary tale. Trust no one, especially your own family, and maybe double-check who's advising you about your heirs. Even after his death, Burgundy itself wouldn't be at peace. It was carved up by the Franks, fought over by rival kings, and transformed from a kingdom into a footnote in the never-ending saga of medieval Europe. Sigismund's name would live on, but mostly as a tragic reminder of how ambition and paranoia could sink even the most well-intentioned kings. Just think about Sigismund of Burgundy for a second. The king who traded a son for a curse, a crown for a sword, and a throne for a well. May your own family never invite you to a dinner that ends with a beheading. Enough of Sigismund, moving on to another unlucky king. Of all the ways for a king to meet his end, on the battlefield, in a coup, via a suspicious cup of wine, nothing quite captures the special flavour of medieval bad luck, like dying on the toilet. That's right, the most unglamorous, humiliating, and decidedly undignified exit imaginable. For a ruler who spent their days issuing decrees, smiting enemies, and pretending to be God's anointed, there was no faster way to have your royal legacy overshadowed than by dying mid-business in the bathroom. And yet, for a few unlucky kings, that's exactly how history chose to remember them. Let's start with the poster child for toilet-related tragedy, Wenceslaus III of Bohemia. Born in 1289, young Wenceslaus was a prince with a fancy title and not much luck. He inherited the crown of Bohemia at 16, only to find himself in the middle of a feud with just about every other king in Europe. He also laid claim to Hungary, because why stop at one kingdom when you can irritate two? Wenceslaus's reign was a masterclass in medieval misfortune. He was beset by rebellious barons, scheming bishops, and enough enemies to fill a jousting tournament. By the time he was 17, his reign was hanging by a thread. And then, in 1306, during a campaign in Poland, he decided to take a moment's rest. On the toilet, naturally. It was the one place a king could be alone, except that he wasn't. According to the chronicles, an assassin slipped in while Wenceslaus was attending to his royal duties and stabbed him repeatedly. A less than dignified end for a teenage king, killed while, quite literally, with his pants down. The assassin vanished, leaving historians to debate whether it was a political hit job or simply the world's worst case of medieval bathroom etiquette. But Wenceslaus wasn't alone in his lavatorial fate. Fast forward a few centuries to Godfrey the Hunchback of Lower Lorraine, duke, knight, and all-around unlucky guy. Born around 1060, Godfrey was known for his piety, his sword skills, and a spectacular lack of luck. He spent most of his reign fighting off invasions, suppressing revolts, and trying not to get stabbed in the back by every cousin with a grudge. Legend has it that Godfrey met his end in 1076 while on a diplomatic trip. He stopped at the castle of Vladingen in the Low Countries for what was supposed to be a peaceful negotiation. But fate, or his enemies, had other plans. While sitting on the medieval equivalent of a commode, a hole in a wooden plank, he was stabbed through the bottom by an assassin hiding below. The killer then made his escape, leaving Godfrey dead on the floor, his dignity flushed away along with his life. Imagine that for a second. A duke, wearing his best chainmail leggings, skewered like a pig while answering nature's call. If there was ever a moment when being a king felt less than royal, that was it. And for all his battles, campaigns, and political intrigue, it's the toilet that history remembers most. Then there's Edmund Ironside of England, who, although not confirmed beyond all doubt, is sometimes said to have suffered the same fate. Edmund, the son of Ethelred the Unready, spent most of his reign in 1016 fighting off the Danish invasion led by Knut the Great. Edmund's life was a series of desperate battles, forced alliances, and constant betrayal. He earned the nickname Ironside because he seemed impossible to kill, until, allegedly, he went to the bathroom. One particularly colourful chronicle, written centuries later, naturally, claimed that Edmund was murdered on the privy, stabbed from beneath in a move that would make even a seasoned medieval hitman wince. The story might be apocryphal. Many historians think he probably died of wounds or disease, but it's too grimly perfect to ignore. After all, what's more medieval than ending a kingdom's last hope on a toilet seat? Of course, it wasn't always assassination. Sometimes royal intestines themselves declared mutiny. Take Henry VI of England, William the Conqueror's youngest son, a man known for his administrative talents, political cunning, and an appetite that could rival a monastery's entire winter stockpile. Henry I, as legend has it, died in 1135 after indulging in a surfeit of lampreys, an eel-like delicacy that even hardened peasants found hard to stomach. The story goes that after a particularly gluttonous feast, heavy on the lampreys, Henry's digestive system revolted. The king retreated to his chamber, possibly the medieval version of the bathroom, where nature took its gruesome course. Whether it was food poisoning, cholera, or a case of ate too much eel, Henry died in agony, leaving his kingdom in chaos and his legacy overshadowed by his tragic last meal. And while he may not have technically died on the toilet, his intestines likely gave him a farewell tour of the facilities before the end. It's hard not to see a certain grim poetry in all this. Kings, surrounded by gold and guards, their crowns shining in candlelight, and yet brought down by the most human of activities. The toilet was the one place no sceptre could save you, no knight could protect you, and no crown could cover the smell. A medieval reminder that no matter how high you rise, everyone's equal on the privy. Even in their deaths, these kings remind us that medieval life was, at its core, brutally human. The same seat of power that bore them to glory could just as easily bear them to their doom, sometimes literally. History loves its ironies, and few are as deliciously dark as a king undone by an arrow, a dagger, or a particularly bad stew at the wrong moment. Oh, here we are, at the end of our grim, grimy, occasionally smelly journey, through the unluckiest kings the Middle Ages had to offer. From suspicious hunting accidents to toilet assassinations, from treacherous brothers to curses that lingered like a bad smell, we've toured the worst days of the best crowned heads in medieval Europe. And let's be honest, it's been a ride, equal parts tragic, absurd, and sometimes even darkly funny. As you lie in your bed tonight, clean sheets, pillow fluffier than a goose's backside, take a moment to appreciate the fact that you're not a medieval king. Because if you were, there's a good chance you'd be having a much rougher time. Let's review the highlights, or, more accurately, the lowlights. Imagine waking up in the morning, with sunlight streaming through your glorious stained glass windows, only to discover that your brother is plotting your murder with the local barons, or that your wife's new hobby is poisoning your breakfast, or that you've just been excommunicated, again, and every monk within 100 miles is writing strongly worded letters about your moral failings. And if that wasn't enough, you'd have to worry about curses from dying Templars, arrows whizzing out of the forest, and your own court astrologer telling you Mercury's in retrograde, so you'd better sleep with one eye open. Not exactly the royal fantasy they promised in the bedtime stories, is it? Medieval kings, despite all their jewels and goblets and embroidered cloaks, were basically trapped in a cosmic joke, given absolute power, but at the cost of constant danger, paranoia, and more than a few humiliating deaths. Just ask William Rufus, who ended his reign face down in a forest with an arrow in his lung, or Charles the Mad, who thought he was made of glass and spent most of his reign trying not to shatter, or Philip V, who tried to rule France but couldn't outwit a Templar curse that read like a particularly vengeful bedtime story. Even the luckier ones, like Edward II, ended up with a story so grim it makes a horror movie look like a light comedy. Betrayed by family, deposed, and, if the chronicles are to be believed, murdered in ways best left unmentioned at dinner parties. The Middle Ages didn't do half measures. They went for the full, messy, tragic ending, every time. And let's not forget the ceremonial indignity of dying on the toilet. Because, honestly, if there's one lesson to be learned here, it's that medieval kings couldn't even go to the bathroom without risking assassination, divine judgment, or an unfortunate mishap with a chamber pot. But here's the thing. These weren't just stories of random misfortune. They were cautionary tales, reminders that even the mightiest can fall, and often do. That power doesn't come with a warranty, and that every crown carries with it the weight of betrayal, disease, and curses from men who'd been barbecued at the stake. It's easy to forget, now that we live in a world of thermostats and antibiotics, just how precarious life was in the medieval world. Even kings, the ones with armies, castles, and the best tapestries money could buy, were only ever one step away from disaster, and if they were unlucky, they'd leave behind a kingdom plunged into chaos, a family squabbling over the scraps, and a cautionary tale for the next king to ponder by candlelight. So tonight, as you curl up in your bed, maybe with a cup of tea, or a podcast that doesn't involve beheadings, give yourself a small pat on the back for making it through another day without being stabbed by a sibling or cursed by a dying knight. You survived traffic, work, and maybe even a passive-aggressive co-worker, but at least your worst day doesn't involve a suspicious hunting accident or a kingdom of peasants revolting because you raised the bread tax. You get to sleep in a bed that isn't stuffed with straw and fleas. You get to brush your teeth without worrying that your dentist is also your barber and also your surgeon. You get to drink water without boiling it first, or praying you won't get dysentery. You can trust that your dinner won't try to kill you, and, best of all, your siblings, hopefully, aren't plotting to overthrow your government or stake a claim to your house while you're taking a nap. Medieval kings had power, but they didn't have safety. They didn't have privacy. They didn't have soap that actually smelled good, or medicine that worked, or even the chance to rule without the constant threat of a dagger in the dark. They didn't have Netflix, or antibiotics, or the certainty that tomorrow wouldn't bring plague, rebellion, or a suspicious cousin with a suspicious smile. You, on the other hand, can wake up tomorrow with a pretty good chance that no one will try to kill you in your sleep. At least, not in a way that makes the local newspaper. Your worst day might involve a traffic jam, a flat tire, or an overly chatty co-worker, but it probably won't end with a rebellion or a suspiciously well-timed hunting trip. And so, dear listener, as the candles sputter and the night air cools, we leave behind the blood-soaked corridors, the echoing cries of betrayal, and the creaking wooden thrones of the unlucky kings who ruled and fell. Their crowns gleamed briefly, their lives flickered like tallow candles, and then, like a bad joke at the wrong feast, snuffed out, leaving behind a kingdom of questions and a chronicle of curses. But you? You're safe in the modern world, where the worst thing that might happen tonight is a neighbour's dog barking at the moon, or your phone deciding to die at 2% just before your alarm goes off. No arrows in the woods. No suspicious stepmothers whispering in dark corners. No boiling water trials to prove your innocence. Just the comfort of your bed, a pillow that doesn't double as a lice farm, and the sweet, sweet relief of modern plumbing. So, my friend, let the ghosts of unlucky kings fade into the background. Let the darkness hold no terrors but the mild annoyance of a flickering streetlight. And when you dream, may it be of clean sheets, quiet nights, and a life free of suspicious hunting accidents. You survived today, you'll survive tomorrow, and with any luck, no one will be sharpening a dagger behind your back, at least not tonight. Until our next dark, winding journey through the cobwebbed halls of history, rest easy, laugh a little, and remember, the past may have been a brutal place, but at least you're here, now, with all your limbs intact and your bed free of straw. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of medieval curses. Good night.